Over the past days and weeks, I've been struck by the accounts of the fall, as it were, of powerful, influential Christian leaders. There's some accounts that are quite prevalent at the moment, especially on the internet, about Ravi Zacharias, a Christian apologist who had his own international ministry, about Jonathan Fletcher, an influential leader and minister amongst evangelical Anglicans in England. Maybe you've heard some of these stories. I'm not going to go into detail, but these are accounts of people I would have listened to and benefited from, even spent a little bit of time with. But people who have abused power as purported Christian leaders and done that in terrible ways. And there are tragically too many others to add to that list. I was struck by a line in Sunday's reading from Mark's Gospel about the Pharisees heading off to plot with the Herodians about how they might kill Jesus. In some ways, it's a different situation, of course, but there's a real similar dynamic there of how people who present such a front of religious respectability, appearing so sound, so apparently concerned with right teaching and holy behaviour, have behind the scenes got it so twisted, exemplifying worldly thinking that the end justifies the means, exerting manipulation and threat over others as though that's the way to get things done, having this outwardly moral lifestyle to maintain while dismissing the personal challenge that Jesus brings to each and every heart. There are so many pertinent reflections on all of this, many of which I've been reading about and you may well have done or could find all over the internet too. We might reflect on how vital it is to hear and tend to the stories of the abused and the broken, who are the very people that Jesus hangs out with here in Mark's Gospel. And here are victims to be prayed for and brought to Jesus for healing. Instead, though, it often seems easy for Christians to be enthralled by powerful, charismatic and gifted leaders, such that we idolize them, we naively defend them as though they're superhuman. We think they're apparently successful, but they're evidently not Christ-like. There are reflections on what benefit can still remain from such ministries. And we must believe that God is sovereign and he brings about good and lasting things even through people who do wrong. Great lessons taught, lives powerfully, spiritually, lastingly changed. We must believe that for our own sake, for God at work in and through our very sinful selves. No one is perfect. God only works through broken humans. But it's also fascinating that in Mark chapter 3, verse 19, in this week's upcoming passage, Judas Iscariot is listed as one of those to whom Jesus gave authority to preach and drive out demons. Presumably, there were people who God blessed through Judas' ministry, despite his overwhelming and defining betrayal. And yet, knowing what we know, do we want to be purposefully continuing to look to the work of such gifted but twisted people for our feeding and instruction? Is there not actually plenty of teaching out there from, yes, still broken, but also humble, repentant, accountable church leaders, ministers, striving to live openly in the way of Christ? And I guess there must be lessons about church, the sort of fellowship and family of God's people that we'll see Jesus building in Mark 3. Of course, churches don't always get it right, but isn't it actually in a local, accountable growing together church family, that we help each other to live the Christian, Christ-like life, teaching and admonishing one another, loving one another, praying for one another, encouraging one another, forgiving one another, bearing one another's burdens, asking each other questions in the ongoing, open, honest messiness of life as disciples. Solo ministries, people put on a pedestal who seem powerfully gifted teachers and leaders, but don't find themselves earthed and rooted in real fellowship. There's a real danger there. But I am struck by this contrast between uses of power. Ruth and I watched this podcast, which was really quite helpful among many other things, between Glenn Scrivener and Mark Maynell, a great discussion. And on one hand, we see there are Christians trying to manipulate people and events, using secular strategies and believing that the end justifies the means, even for very good ends, being holier, building the church. But the kingdom is as much about means as it is about ends. It's as much about how we go about things as what it is we're looking to achieve. And so on the other hand, there's the Christ-like model of power, which is humbly to use it to serve others, to choose the cross-shaped life. As Mark will say of Christ, the Son of Man, this man with the very power and authority of God, to whom every knee shall bow, and whom everyone must fully obey, yet he came not to be served, but to serve. And that's a profound reflection as today we begin Lent and humbly fix our eyes on Christ and the cross. A friend of mine would ask, what does success look like when you follow the man who died on a cross? Well, it doesn't look that glitzy or powerful or prestigious. It doesn't need to use intimidation, coercion, or fear. It doesn't look like teaming up with secular government to impose Christian rights and attitudes. Maybe that should cause political reflection for Christians in the USA and here. It looks like being humble and loving and persevering with integrity, often, very often in the margins and away from the limelight. Perhaps we should simply be praying for ourselves and others in leadership, especially Christian leadership, locally at St. Phil Road, more widely in our denomination and around the world. That time and again, we, the church, the people of God, who espouse the kingdom of Christ and its values, would not choose worldly models of power and be sucked in by that and being served, but choose the way and the life of Christ, of humble service.
From heaven you came, helpless babe, entered our world, your glory veiled, not to be served, but to serve, and give your life that we might live. This is our God, the servant King. He calls us now to follow Him. is our God, the servant King. He calls us now to follow Him, to bring our lives as a daily offering of worship to the servant King. Come see His hands and His feet, the scars that speak of sacrifice, hands that flung stars into space, to cruel nails surrender. This is our God, the servant King. He calls us now to follow Him, to bring our lives as a daily offering of worship to the servant King. So let us learn how to serve, and in our lives enthrone Him, each other's needs to prefer. For it is Christ we're serving. This is our God, the servant King. He calls us now to follow Him, to bring our lives as a daily offering of worship to the servant King. The servant King.
I said just earlier that the kingdom of Christ isn't achieved with worldly power. But we do want to engage with governments when we believe that some lives made in the image of God, are being devalued and people with little voice are being discriminated against. Yesterday, Tuesday the 16th of February, legislation was introduced to the Northern Ireland Assembly which would remove provisions in that recent abortion legislation that otherwise allow for terminations up to full term in the case of non-fatal disability. So those non-fatal disabilities could include clubfoot, cleft palate, or Down syndrome, amongst other diagnoses. So this private member's bill brought forward yesterday is called the Severe Fetal Impairment Abortion Amendment Bill. It's a long title, but if passed, it would remove provision for such abortions. Now, that's not everything we might want to change about the recent distressing legislation, but it is a step in the right direction. So pray for the Assembly and pray for MLAs as they engage and vote on this in the coming weeks, that they may vote for what gives life rather than takes it away. You might also like to write to your MLA. The moderator David Bruce has, and the letter he's written is on our website below this video. You might find it helpful to read in writing your own email or letter. But now, let's do the most powerful thing we can do and pray to the God of heaven who sits on the throne.